thank the organisers for putting on such a fantastic event, and it's a great privilege and honour to be here and meet some fantastic researchers. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science, but I'm going to leave all the clever stuff to the people who follow me, and they will present with various studies and statistics. What I want to do really is to set a context for thinking about compassion. But before I do, I want to just warn you, you've got to be careful with this compassion stuff, because one day there was a lady who was a little bit overweight, and she had a trip on the stairs and fell down and banged her head. And while she was unconscious, she had a vision that she went to heaven. And in heaven she saw God, and she said, "Oh, that's it, then I'm done for." And he said, No, you've got 40 years as long as you look after yourself, You've got to look after yourself. So eventually she came round, and she decided, right, 40 years, I'm going to do that. So she went on a diet, and she went to the gym, and she got fit. She looked absolutely amazing, and then for the last little bit, she went for some plastic surgery. She came out of the hospital, walked across the road, and got knocked over by the bus. She ended up in heaven and said, "God, you told me I had 40 years. And he said, "I'm terribly sorry. I just didn't recognize you." So you have to be careful. You never know what compassion is going to do for you. Okay, so the key thing about compassion, then, it's really about a way of engaging and working with suffering. And through the work that I do as a clinical psychologist, it's very clear that there are two problems that we need to think about. We need to think about what it is that facilitates compassion, but also what it is that blocks it. Because in the work that I do, the blocking of compassion is one of the key things that we have to focus on. And we need to think about this in terms of groups, societies, and nations. So what is it that blocks compassion? And I'm going to slightly orientate my talk to that today. So let's think about this. Why do we need compassion? Well, we need compassion because life is very hard, see? We don't want to see you like this after the conference. Okay, so why is life hard? Why is life difficult? Now, of course, for those of you who follow Buddhist traditions, this is a very important question that the Buddha answered with the Four Noble Truths. But recent science has also taught us there are some other reasons. One of them is the fact that we are an evolved species, and therefore our brains are built by our genes. Okay, so I didn't choose to have the brain that I have. It was built for me, and it turns out to be a primate brain rather than a rabbit brain or a fish brain. Although if you ask my wife, she says I'm not sure about that, but there we are. So we have the brains that we have, and in those brains come various mechanisms to do different things. And we're going to be looking at what we are evolved to do, what our motivational systems are in a moment. The second reality is a tricky one to face, isn't it? It's the fact that we only have a very short time here, 25 to 35,000 days if you're lucky. And during that time, we're confronted with all kinds of illnesses and diseases and dysfunctions. It's all a little bit of a genetic lottery. And we were hearing just a moment ago about children who die, but some of the ways in which we die are pretty damn awful. I watched my mother die of vascular dementia and my father die of cancer, and neither of them were very good. The fact of the matter is that life involves suffering, and all of us are in this boat. No one escapes the fact that we grow and we decay and die, and that's another reason for understanding why it's so important to work together. If you think about medicine, for example, one of the great gifts of medicine was to rid the world of smallpox. Smallpox was a terrible way to die. The way in which we deal with suffering is to work together and to understand the sources of suffering. The third reason is the fact that all of us are socially constructed. Now, in the Buddhist traditions, you will meditate on the nature of the reality or the illusion of the self and so forth, but the self is an illusion for another reason as well, and that is we are created by our cultures. And the way in which we talk to our patients about this is, look, if I had been adopted as a 3-day-old baby, say there was some violent drug gang down the road and their boss wanted a baby because he couldn't have one, so they sent people out and they adopted me, they kidnapped me, would I be this? No, I would not be this. The chances are I would be quite violent. I would be covered in tattoos, and I hate tattoos, because that is the reality. That is what happens to young males who grow up in these environments. Would that be my fault? I didn't choose to be kidnapped at 3 days old. No. So the key then is recognizing these three key factors that we all come into this world. We have a brain that's been built by evolution. We're not going to be here for very long. The process of life can be full of suffering and difficulty, and we're socially constructed. It does get better. It's all right. It sounds a little bit pessimistic. But to confront compassion means that we have to really understand what is it that we're up against. What do we need compassion for? What is the basis of our pursuit of compassion? Now, another reason that we have to have compassion is the fact that our brains are very tricky. So we have brains which have all kinds of motives and emotions which come from our evolutionary past. But it turns out about 2 million years ago, humans started to get bright. They got smart. And so they started to develop these capacities. And it's these capacities that make us the species that we are and make us different from other species. It's these capacities for thinking, reasoning, the use of language, being clever, if you like, that has allowed us to be here today, to build these buildings, to have the science. It's wonderful, except that, as with so much in evolution, there's always a downside. And the downside is that this part of your mind can also drive you crazy. And the reason that it does that is because when humans are confronted with certain kinds of events, they get into loops. Here's an example. Imagine a zebra has run away from a lion and they've just managed to escape, and the lion's wandered off. Within quite a short period of time, the zebra will settle down and will go back to grazing to the herd, right? But this probably wouldn't happen for a human, because a human would start thinking, oh my God, can you imagine what would have happened if I'd been caught? I can just imagine my leg being eaten, bitten, and oh no. So we start to imagine all kinds of horrible things. So we have this way of thinking, well, what if, right? We wake up in the middle of the night. Oh my God, what happens tomorrow? What happens if my children go out there? So it's great at one level, but at another level, of course, it creates loops in the mind. And these loops in the mind, the way cognition and thinking and emotion gets churned around when we ruminate and we keep activating the emotion, has been the subject for a lot of psychological investigation and therapy. If it's anger or vengeance, then you're in serious trouble, because if you create loops in the mind, the only thing you're wanting to do is to act on your vengeance. So, am I going the wrong way? I'm going the wrong way. There we go. So there we are. So the point is, it was all quite simple in the beginning until we got to think, and then we started to ask questions, and then it got much more difficult. The other thing is that you come with built-in biases, and these are biases in how easy it is to learn certain things. So we know as psychologists it's much easier for you to learn to be frightened of snakes than it is of electricity. We know that some of the biases that we have in our reasoning are unconscious. And we know that we have biases, as the Dalai Lama mentioned just a moment ago in his message, that we can be very self-focused. We can also be very kin-focused. So these are biases that are built into us through evolution. And this is easy to demonstrate. Imagine that you have a baby and the baby is taken away for weighing, and then the doctors come back to you and say, I'm terribly sorry, we've lost track of your baby. But don't worry, because we had a lot of wonderful babies born today. You can come and choose one. We're very interested in our own genes. And so we spend massive amounts of money on our own children, while the children just a few thousand miles away die. We also have in-group preferences. And in-group tribalism is a curse of humanity. It's the source of atrocities. But this is not our fault. These are biases that we come with into the world. And as was mentioned again by the Dalai Lama, the idea is learning to cultivate something different. And we can do this through the process of mindfulness, which many other people will talk about today, and also by learning that mindfulness helps you break up these loops, and also compassion. Now, compassion, in our approach, doesn't come out of mindfulness itself. It can do, but it's a deliberate cultivation of a motivational system, the desire to bring compassion into the world. And a motivational system will organize all of the other factors in your mind. It will organize what you think about, it will organize your attention, it will organize your behavior. If you're motivated to become compassionate, this is important. On the other hand, if you're motivated by that motivation, then your brain is organized in a different way. So these are really quite important, particularly when we start thinking about what kind of society are we creating. Are we creating that one or that one? And I'm going to be arguing that unfortunately, or fortunately, we have gone a little bit too far in creating competitive minds, and competitive minds have all kinds of problems with them. Let's think very briefly about the emotions. Now, motives are the things that guide you in your actions, they're what you want to do, but emotions are the things that arise moment by moment according to how you're doing. And we know that there are different types of emotions, and these different types of emotions are very important when understanding compassion, because it's how these emotion systems work together that enables us to have the experience of compassion and be compassionate or not. One set of emotions is very much focused on threat. So when you become threatened, you have to be quickly aroused. Another set of emotions is focused on achieving things. It excites you. But there's a third set of emotions which is related to the feelings of calming down, peaceful well-being, feeling safe. And these emotional systems utilize overlapping but also different physiological systems, which you'll be hearing more about as the conference goes on. So we can represent these in terms of these three systems that are all interacting. Now, the way in which these emotions interact has quite a lot to tell us about the ability to experience compassion or not. So let's say if you think of your threat system is one of the most important emotion processing systems. A long time ago, an American psychologist called Roy Baumeister wrote a very famous piece called Bad is Stronger Than Good. What he meant by that is that your threat emotions will dominate other aspects of your processing. And this is pretty easy to demonstrate. Firstly, if you're in the jungle and you see something moving in the bushes, you have to lose interest in the bananas or the wonderful sky or whatever it is and run. So you have to turn off interest, positive emotion, interest. But listen to this. Supposing that you go Christmas shopping in a few weeks' time and you go into 10 shops, and in 9 shops, the people are very happy, are very kind to you, and they smile at you, and they say, well, how can I help you? And they get you a present that you're very happy with. But in one shop, the person is very rude. They keep you waiting. They don't want to serve you particularly. They give you the wrong change. You feel you've been cheated. Who do you talk about when you go home? The threat system means that you probably talk about that one and you'll forget the 90% of the people who were kind, unless you pay attention to this process, that your threat system will always grab your attention if you let it. And of course, what we know is that when people have mental health difficulties, that's exactly what's happened. A lot of their attention is being regulated by the threat system. It creates loops in the mind and they can't get out. And you probably noticed that the media is like this too. The good stories in the healthcare service you don't often hear much about. The bad stories you do. Now, I'm not saying for a moment you shouldn't, but the balance. If you just focus on threat, 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 we're out of balance. What about... you have to be prepared, you see. The other thing is we can, of course, threaten each other. This is the early training karate. Okay, what about this other emotion system, which is again very important? This is a system which is linked to excitement, pleasure, and joy, right? So if you win the lottery, the chances are you will become mildly hypomanic. You will have a hypomania. Okay, we know this. You'll have racing thoughts, you'll have intrusive thoughts, you won't be able to settle, and you certainly won't sleep very well for a night or two. Joyfulness is also incredibly important in the experience of each other, taking joy in each other, and the evidence is overwhelming that the ability to create joyfulness in the parent-child relationship is very important for the child's ability to feel secure in themselves, to develop confidence, and to be good at regulating their own emotions. When this joyfulness in relationship doesn't happen, maybe because the mother is depressed and she can't enjoy her baby, or has unresolved trauma herself and has what we call borderline difficulties or whatever, then the baby's joy systems in relationships don't develop in quite the same way. So there we are. We see this throughout nature. And of course, taking joy with each other is very important, but you can make mistakes, so you've got to be careful. So what about the third system? Now, the third system is very interesting because this is a calming system. This is a calming down system. It's linked to parasympathetic arousal. And this system is linked to the ability to feel calmed in the presence of kindness. So from the day that we're born to the day that we die, calmness will calm you, right? And the reasons for this is because in the infant-parent relationship, in the attachment relationship, the parent is the individual that calms the distress in the infant. So we're biologically set up for this. And I would guarantee that if you are distressed or something upsetting happens to you, the first thing you'll want to do is to go to somebody who you feel loves you or cares about you and talk to them, and if they will listen to you and give you a hug. That's what you do. You will seek out another human being to be kind and compassionate to you. So basically, that's how your brain is set up. And that's been set up like that for 120 million years. It's been growing for 120 million years. The ability of a soothing system to calm you when you're threatened is ancient. Okay? So this is really important. And caring, then, is about having an interest in the welfare of others because you're happy together. Remember the baby enjoying the pleasure of the mother? We're happy together. To make you happy makes me happy. It's called affect matching, and it has some degree of self-interest. So the motive and wish for others to be happy is good because it makes you happy. So happiness is something that we share, and we can stimulate each other's happiness system, and that also builds supportive relationships. What about concern for others' distress? Well, that too evolved within the attachment dynamic where the parent pays attention to the distress caused of the child. And that motivates the wish for that distress to cease. And if we expand that beyond our kin, then that makes for the wish for others to be free from suffering. So these motives, these desires are not rooted in some mythical psychological state. They are actually rooted in very powerful biological mechanisms if we learn how to cultivate them. And we also know that being cared for, the experience of being cared for, has a phenomenal range of effects on has a whole range of effects, including genetic expression. The genes in my frontal cortex will be very differently expressed if I was kidnapped into a violent drug gang. This version of Paul Gilbert simply would not exist. My frontal cortex would be quite different if I'd grown up in that environment. Stress reactivity, immune system functioning, your frontal cortex, illness, your susceptibility to illness and recovery. We now know that even the types of illnesses you're vulnerable to are linked to the kinds of love and affection, or the lack of it, you had in your childhood. Your core values, your sense of yourself, and your ability for compassion and empathy, these are all created in the context of loving relationships, particularly when we're young. So the fact of the matter is then that while I wouldn't say that compassion is the core of us, because I think there are many different motivational systems, there is overwhelming evidence that humans function best, the frontal cortex, stress systems, their immune systems, cardiovascular systems, when they are able to be loving, affiliative, and caring rather than hating, and when they feel loved and valued rather than unloved and devalued. There is absolutely, in my view, no doubt at all about this. If you want to mature a good frontal cortex, that's what you do. So compassion then really is all about understanding these wisdoms which have been around for a long time, that the evolution has made our brains highly sensitive to kindness, both the kindness we give ourselves and the kindness of others. So I'm going to now move on a little bit to talking about compassion, and I know Paul Ekman is coming afterwards. But so if we think about compassion, we think about the importance of kindness, love, and affection, as I've just said. Compassion really is this capacity for sensitivity to suffering of self and others with the commitment to relieve it and prevent it. And that's a fairly standard view. It's certainly in the Buddhist traditions, but it's in other traditions as well. But it turns out that if you look into this deeply, there are two different psychologies to it. One is the psychology of engagement, to turn towards rather than avoid suffering, to pay attention to suffering, to look into the face of suffering. And the other is if you do that, and that was mentioned earlier as well, what are you going to do? Because if you only do that, then you can easily become overwhelmed and turn away. So you have to have ways in which you can alleviate, hold, contain the suffering that you engage with. And we also know, and again this was mentioned earlier, that the whole issue of compassion is like a flow. There's the compassion that you are open to from other people. And in the work I do with depressed patients, they're often not very open to it. Even when people are kind to them, they either feel obligated or they can't really experience love, even when people are being loving. There's the compassion that you feel for others, that you give out to others, and there's also self-compassion. And there's now lots and lots of evidence that if you do meditations based on these kinds of dynamics of intentionally practicing the feelings of compassion going out, the feelings of compassion coming in, and being self-compassionate, that this has impacts on mental states and a range of biological functions. So let's have a think about this then. Supposing we see suffering, supposing we see a person in this dire situation, what would we need to feel compassion? Okay, so when we do our training, this is what we ask. But the key issue is what blocks it. And I was doing this recently with a group, and a police person came up to me afterwards and said, that was a really interesting thing, because the first thing when you showed that picture I thought was drug addict. And if you ask people to write down anonymously on a piece of paper what would block your compassion for this person, they would say things like immigrant, they shouldn't be here, they're treating their child badly. They have a whole range of reasons which actually blocks them in their ability to have compassion. Now, the point about this is it's not a blaming or a shaming game, it's a curiosity. This is interesting. This is important. To understand how we facilitate compassion, we have to also understand how we block it. So compassion in our model then involves the psychology of engagement. Firstly, the motivation, then we pay attention, we become sensitive to suffering. When we do that, we are emotionally moved, we have what is called a sympathetic connection, but then we have to be able to tolerate that distress. There's no point engaging with suffering if we can't tolerate distress. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes, so this is going to be super quick. Empathy, of course, is extremely important, and here it's the motivation which actually makes empathy into compassion, right? Without empathy, compassion is tricky because you're not going to have much of an idea. But empathy itself can be used in all kinds of ways. Okay, so the worst torture to have is an empathic one, because the non-empathic one puts the gun to your head, and you say, "No, I will not tell you my secret. You blow up my head." But the empathic one puts it to your child's. They know, see? So what about the qualities that we need then in order to be able to alleviate? Firstly, paying attention, training ourselves in paying attention. Remember the Christmas shoppers? With our patients, for example, we teach them, pay attention to what was helpful, not just what was not helpful. Learning how to reason. There's a lot of cognitive therapy, which is very helpful here. The feeling, loving kindness, developing loving kindness meditations. The importance of behavior. Here we talk about compassionate courage. Learning how to use imagery in meditation techniques, and learning how to use the body. So I want to now just really briefly talk about the challenges. The challenges really are the fact that we have different motivational systems within us. And the problem is how society actually stimulates these systems within us. Remember, if I had been taken as a 3-day-old baby, this would not exist. We are created in our social context, and we have to understand that if we create certain social contexts, we will create certain kinds of mind. We know, for example, that although humans can indeed be very caring, they can also be pretty awful. Humans can be absolute demons. The history of torture by humans is horrendous. Even in our entertainment, increasingly, people recognize that our entertainment is becoming more violent. So we have to understand then how compassion gets turned on and off. And that's no one's fault, right? But it's linked to how our brain works in certain contexts. And understanding what turns it on and what turns it off has huge implications. So the trouble is, if we have too much of a competitive mind, and in the health service, there is nothing but a competitive mind. It's all competitive edge, do more for less. Then the trouble is we have a world that does this, while other people have that. That some people live like this, where other people live like that. Now, this is not to blame or shame. It's nobody's fault. It goes back to these biological biases. And as the Dalai Lama mentioned, unless we see this and make a decision about this, what we're going to do about this brain of ours, then we're going to be in trouble. And of course, tribal violence is horrendous. Tribal violence goes on all over the world right now. Okay? We are a very tribal species. There are also species of monkeys that are at war against each other as well. It's not our fault, right? We don't blame or shame, but we try to understand the process, because otherwise that's what we end up with. And we know then from people like Philip Zimbardo and many others that actually you can take people and you can encourage them, entice them to do all kinds of very bad things. So we have to understand the social contexts. Okay, so I'll go through this quickly. Now, social context is extremely important. Here's one good example of where you have to be very careful how you target psychology to individuals. And this is in the area of weight. We are evolved for a scarcity. We're evolved for the seafood and eat it diet. We're basically scavengers. We're slim-boned, and we were normally on the move quite a lot. We're not adapted for quick inhibition of food. So what happens when you take the species that food was very difficult, and even now children are dying at quite a rate in the third world, and then you provide a culture, you change the culture and you give them all this fantastic food. Well, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. And then you say, actually, if you're obese, that's your fault. No. See, look what's happened to poor old Michelangelo on the new diet. I mean, it's nobody's fault, right? So the key thing when you take a social position of understanding facilitation blocks and you root it in a social context is you recognize that individuals are to some extent limited in their ability to exert control. You will stimulate that ability to exert control if you do various forms of training. I have 1 minute, but they are limited. So just go through this very quickly. Okay, there we go. Okay, 1 minute. So, conditions to build a compassionate society. To see the sources of suffering are within ourselves. It's not our fault. It's the way we were born. It's the way we've been sculptured. But what is it when we wake up to this reality? You wake up and you realize what's going on in your mind, that your mind really is not your own unless you choose to make it your own. What do we cultivate? And the point is we need to cultivate joy, because although compassion focuses on suffering, it's important to cultivate the joy of helping. Okay? The joy of working together. Create a sense of we-ness rather than me-ness. Build bottom-up on good practices. Okay? The key thing of a compassionate society is you cannot create it top-down. You can't create it with a tick box. We need public pressure on governments, because there is no doubt at all. There's a wonderful book called The Price of Civilization by Jeffrey Sachs. I would suggest you read it. I mean, there's no doubt at all that in the last 20, 30 years, the combination of the media, the business, and governments have combined to create a competitive psychology that is running roughshod over moral and compassionate values. And the other thing to leave you with is that you don't necessarily need to be practicing compassion and mindfulness 40 minutes a day. Do you remember this person, right? Compassion for this person didn't come out of being a particularly compassionate being or doing mindfulness. It came out of an understanding of the problems in the world and an anger that we had to do something about it, and brought together people in their millions, and they did. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the last thing I'm going to say. My colleague is here with his shepherd's hook. Thank you very much.